A startling undercover video has torn through a fragile calm and forced questions that go to the heart of secrecy, law, and the limits of military authority. What began as an activist sting has become overnight a national security controversy. A recording that shows a man identified as a branch chief responsible for nuclear and chemical oversight speaking on camera and saying things that, if true, would be deeply consequential. In the footage, the man is presented as someone whose job is to keep dangerous systems secure and to ensure that only reliable personnel have access to them. On tape, he is heard to say plainly, "No unstable individuals get access to such systems." Taken alone, those words can read as the responsible description of a safety officer's duty. In context, in a public setting and on camera, they take on a far more troubling character. The most explosive claims in the video are the kind that can reshape public debate in an instant. The man is recorded describing alleged access to chemical agents, recounting an incident inside a government laboratory that led to a scientist's exposure, and most consequentially implying that the top leadership of a foreign capital could be considered a legitimate target under certain conditions. The tape also includes what is presented as an admission that strikes in the past caused civilian deaths and that those fatalities were collateral damage. If those words were indeed spoken as they appear in the recording, they cross a line from closed-door operational discussion to a public disclosure that raises questions of international law, arms control commitments, and the moral calculus of warfare. The Chemical Weapons Convention prohibits the development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. The United States has long declared that it destroyed its declared stockpiles. Any suggestion to the contrary or any allegation that nerve agents remain accessible or that a laboratory IT incident exposed a scientist to such agents demand an independent, transparent verification. Within hours of the video circulating, the Army moved to place the soldier identified in the footage on administrative leave and announced an investigation. Officials emphasized that there was not yet any official determination that classified information had been disclosed or that the statements in the recording were accurate, complete, or free from distortion. That is a standard and necessary caveat. Investigations of this sort must establish not only what was said, but whether the speaker had access to the information he described and whether any operational security or legal boundaries were crossed. Context matters. Were the comments off the cuff, exaggerated, or even joking? Were they clipped or edited in ways that altered their meaning? Was the person on camera actually in the role attributed to him? Those are precisely the questions investigators will be tasked to answer. There is, however, a broader diplomatic and security backdrop that makes every word in the clip more combustible. The recording arrives at a moment when a tentative pause in hostilities across the Middle East had been hanging by a thread. Senior figures in Washington, from the White House to intelligence leadership, were reported to be wrestling with next steps, whether to press a military advantage or to press for a diplomatic opening. In recent weeks, there were accounts of a decision point, a moment when senior policymakers weighed a return to strikes and instead chose to extend a pause in order to buy time for diplomacy. That choice reflected a difficult calculation. Military force remains a lever in the national toolbox, but the political, economic, and human costs of renewed conflict are immense. Into that brittle pause comes a tape that, if taken literally, suggests that lines once considered off limits are being discussed casually in a public setting by someone who may be responsible for the stewardship of the systems meant to underpin deterrence. The implications are several and profound. First, the suggestion that personnel continue to have access to chemical agents or that those agents have real-world effect described in stark, graphic terms would immediately raise legal and diplomatic alarms. Allies and adversaries alike would demand answers. Allies and adversaries alike would demand answers. Has treaty compliance been maintained? Are relevant materials properly secured? Who ultimately has authority over employment of such agents? Those are not abstract questions. They go to the heart of whether international commitments are intact and whether the structures that prevent catastrophic accidents are functioning. Second, the recorded reference to targeting top political leadership is politically combustible. Any suggestion of planning or contemplating strikes on a foreign country's highest office holders moves the conversation from deterrence to potential escalation. Even the mere perception that such options are and the table can harden negotiating positions, rally domestic audiences toward retribution, and push a fragile regional balance toward rupture. Third, the admission as presented that strikes may have killed children and that those deaths were described as collateral damage, cuts to the core of public legitimacy for military action. War has always involved tragic civilian harm, but when allegations of child casualties enter public discourse alongside claims that senior leadership might be targeted, political fallout multiplies. Governments, human rights organizations, and international bodies will demand answers. The fog of war gives way to the glare of public scrutiny. There is yet another layer to the story: operational details of sensors, radar arrays, and real-time tracking. The recorded speaker reportedly discussed missile detection, satellite systems, radar capabilities, and the ability to analyze speed and trajectory in real time. To anyone who follows modern military technology, the existence of sophisticated tracking and early warning systems is an accepted fact. The question is whether operational details that might compromise methods or reveal classified sensor and analysis capabilities were inappropriately disclosed. Across all these lines of inquiry, a handful of fundamentals remain: authenticity, context, access, and chain of command. Was the recording edited, selectively clipped, or presented without key context? Did the speaker have the clearance and proximity to the systems he described? If not, how did he come to make such assertions? And if he did, were legal authorizations observed? The Army's immediate response, placing the individual on administrative leave and opening an investigation, is the kind of institutional move designed to preserve evidence and signal seriousness. What happens next will determine whether this becomes a contained personnel case, possibly with corrective action or criminal referral, or whether it blooms into a brawl. Older diplomatic crisis that compels public explanation of higher levels. From Tehran's perspective, authentic or not, the tape is a bargaining chip. Hardliners will seize on the footage to argue that their leadership is under threat, to justify retaliatory measures, and to push back on concessions. Moderates who might otherwise be inclined toward negotiation could find themselves boxed in by public pressure and domestic politics. When one side believes its leadership is being openly discussed as a potential target, trust drains away. Negotiation space narrows in a way that is often irreversible. The regional dynamics matter. The recording lands against a backdrop of economic pressures, sanctions, tightened control of key waterways, and a calculus in which every public statement is read as a signal. The closure or tightening of the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions on shipping, and political pressure all narrow options for diplomacy and increase the risk of miscalculation. In such an environment, rhetoric becomes action. There is a legal and moral dimension worth underlining. The Chemical Weapons Convention, the international instrument that governs this realm, prohibits the development, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. Any credible evidence to the contrary or any suggestion of negligent handling in a laboratory setting would demand a transparent, verifiable accounting to reassure partners in the wider international community. The use of force against political leaders carries its own legal and strategic consequences. Targeted killings of high state actors reside in a complex matrix of domestic policy, international law, and strategic calculus. If the recording proves to reflect real operational intent, it raises urgent questions about chain of command, legal authorizations, and the potential for deadly miscalculation. In Washington, the political impact will be immediate and raw. Elected officials across the spectrum will press for briefings and for clarity. Congressional oversight bodies will demand access to underlying evidence. Opponents will seize on missteps to portray the administration as reckless. Supporters will be forced to reconcile security claims with legal and ethical boundaries. For the president, the calculus is particularly thorny. Projecting strength can be politically advantageous, but the costs of misjudgment in the region are not easily contained at home or abroad. For the public, the demand for clarity is both simple and devilishly hard to satisfy. Was information improperly shared? Were treaty obligations honored? Were civilian deaths acknowledged accurately if wrongdoing or negligence is found? What accountability will follow? These questions will not be settled by a single video clip or a quick public statement. Rigorous investigation, clear disclosure of what can be disclosed without compromising legitimate national security interests, and an honest accounting where misconduct or negligence is found are required. D. There are signs to watch for as this episode unfolds. The pace and openness of the Army's inquiry will speak volumes. Will independent agencies be asked to assist? Will the administration provide substantive answers about capabilities and the veracity of the claims? Or will it defer to classified channels and closed briefings? How will hierarchically and operationally? Each of those moves will shape whether this becomes a contained personnel issue, an international spat, or a trigger for renewed hostilities. Expect also an immediate domestic political theater. Oversight hearings, classified briefings, and public statements will follow. Expect denials where appropriate and a steady drip of detail as investigators examine raw footage, interview witnesses, and cross-check claims against inventories and records. Expect Tehran to press its own narrative, to amplify what it sees as evidence of hostile intent, and to rally domestic and regional support. Expect allied core pidals to ask hard questions about stewardship and discipline, and for adversaries to look for openings to exploit division. There is a human dimension that is easy to lose sight of in the rush to indict or exonerate a person on camera. Soldiers and officers who handle hazardous materials do so under strict protocols precisely because the stakes are existential. When those procedures are followed, catastrophe is averted. When they are violated, even by accident, consequences can be horrific and far-reaching. That is why investigations must be both thorough and fair, and why any disciplinary measures must be proportionate and transparent within the limits of protecting genuine national security interests. This episode will test institutional processes on both sides of the aisle. It will test the professionalism of military and civilian oversight mechanisms, and it will test the ability of democratic institutions to balance secrecy and accountability in an era of viral videos and instant instantaneous amplification. A single recording can change the tenor of policy debates, force reassessments of alliances, and alter the course of negotiations. Public leaders must respond with speed and care, swift enough to prevent dangerous escalation, cautious enough to protect real security interests, and honest enough to preserve public trust. There are practical steps that must follow. First, a forensic review of the footage, authentication, metadata, transcript verification and examination for edits. Second, interviews with witnesses and colleagues that establish the speaker's role and access. Third, a cross-check against inventories, custody logs, and classified records that could confirm or refute the substance of the claims. Fourth, legal review of authorizations and chain of command procedures that govern the specific capabilities discussed. And finally, a public accounting to the extent security permits that reconciles what can be said in public with what must remain classy feed. For regional actors, the stakes are immediate. Hardliners may use the tape to demand retribution or to justify a harder line. Moderates may use it to argue for concessions or for a cooling of tensions. External powers will watch how quickly transparency is offered and whether the investigation assuages fears of proliferation, negligence, or policy drift. For citizens watching from afar, the impulse is natural: demand immediate clarity and swift action. For leaders, the requirement is different and far harder: to act with deliberation, investigate fully, protect genuinely sensitive information, and provide the public with as much transparency as security permits. The balance between those imperatives will not only shape the next news cycle, it may determine whether a pause in violence endures or whether conflict resumes with consequences none of us can afford. In the end, this episode is a reminder that in an interconnected world, a single conversation can touch on treaties. Fam, Illy's grieving for lost children, the secret architectures of defense, and the fragile threads of diplomacy. How those threads are mended or allowed to fray may determine whether a pause in violence holds or whether a wider conflagration follows. For now, investigators will have their work cut out. The questions are concrete. Did the person recorded have access to the claims he described? Were classified methods revealed? Were gaps in training, supervision, or culture responsible for a private conversation becoming public? The answers will determine not only the fate of the individual on administrative leave, but the broader confidence of allies and the willingness of adversaries to either escalate or de-escalate. What is already clear is this: secrecy, once breached, can be as contagious as a rumor. In an age where video moves faster than verification, public leaders must move with both urgency and restraint to prevent a single recording from becoming the spark that sets